let's get to the meat of why you're here today. And that is to hear Sandy Newton talk about historic gardening at Arlington House. So let me tell you a little bit about Sandy. I have like an entire page about her. I'm not going to go all that with you, but suffice to say, she has loved history since she could breathe. She has been involved in every historical society wherever she and her husband were stationed. And once they settled in Arlington, she has been really intricately involved in so many historic places around this area. For example, she has been a reenactor at Mount Vernon and a volunteer there with textile reenactment. And I'm just touching the tip of the iceberg here. She has a degree in textiles, and she was a curator at the Hillwood Museum, where she cataloged and identified the lace collection. That's a far cry from gardening, but it definitely speaks to a love of history. She was president of the Arlington Civic Federation. She is this is her second year on the board of the Arlington Historical Society, and she is our secretary this year. And again, she has such a long list of being involved in the community and being involved in history that she is the perfect presenter to talk to us about gardening in a historic manner at Arlington House. Sandy.
Did you say get to the beat of the subject or no? Me. Oh, okay. I just was wondering. Okay. So I want to offer a disclaimer before I start. I'm not representing the Park Service. I'm a volunteer, and I've been working there for 12 years as a volunteer. And I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. I'm just a volunteer, and this is my 12 years of history. So most of you are familiar with this vision of Arlington House, but we're going to the backside. So this is where the vegetable garden is. These are the people that are involved in this, and especially the people involved in here. The vegetable garden is behind the North Slave Quarters by the well, the original well, so they had water close. When you would come to Arlington House, this is the property that you would go over. And I don't know if you can see the little rectangles, the black rectangles there on the map. Those are enslaved houses. And each of those people had a garden as well. And they would work that when? At night. So a little bit different. If you were visiting the Custis's, you would come from the southeast and you would come around to the flower garden, and then you would go to the portico. I think that the garden is a hook to get people to learn history. Everyone eats, there's food. I came as a demonstrator, as Annette said. I had worked at Mount Vernon for 32 years. And I had played a midwife. Well, I had to do research for that. So I went through the manager's work records of the sewers, knitters, and spinners. And if you go to Mount Vernon and punch that in, you can learn all about them. What is interesting about that is when someone had a baby, they were off for 6 weeks and someone else would take their place. So you would get to know a lot of people. I came to Arlington House selfishly. I wanted to know what happened to them. I knew Carolyn Branham had gone to Arlington House. I knew where she was buried, but what happened in between? Also, what happened to Peg and Doll and Sal and Judy? I followed these people, shared their history, and 1 year after arriving, the supervisor of the Park Service asked me and Judy Sherman, another guide, if we would be interested in starting up the vegetable garden. It had been fallow for a couple of years because of renovations. And it had been tended by the Park Service before that, and the person doing that was retiring. So we said yes. They asked us to do garden talks. This is one of the garden talks and demonstrations where kids could learn to weave. And I'll explain why we would do that. And this is another one that we had as well. I wanted to know, Judy and I wanted to know, what did they grow in the Custis era? What did they grow in the Lee era? What happened in the Civil War? And we were kind of a pair. Judy was coiffed. She never sweat. I can't say the same. So, and those of you who've worked with me know that's true. So, we didn't have a lot of volunteers. So what did we do? We planted these 3 things because we wanted to talk about the history of the 3 other properties that Custis owned: Roman Coke, Smith Island, White House. So we grew flax, that's the green stuff, tobacco, and then cotton. In case you gardeners wonder, we kept the flax away from the tobacco because it can get a wilt. So one was on one side, one was on the other side. So it covered a lot of ground, and so our veggies were to the front. We were planting in the Sankofa way. And because we suspected that probably the enslaved were doing the same thing. Sankofa is a Ghana term, and it means to go back and bring forward, or heritage. It also means that you're not using plow culture, that it's hoe culture, and you just needed a wide enough space for someone's foot and someone's hoe. It isn't necessarily laid out in rows, but it is companion planting. You all know the 3 sisters. So you would have corn, you would have beans, you would have squash or pumpkins, and they would support the other. Radishes were part of that too, because they go quickly. So you would use them to shade or protect plants of leeks and carrots until they got big enough to where they could take care of themselves. And by then you're harvesting the radishes. Dutch cabbage, Custis had many kinds of cabbage, but this is one of them. And they grew a lot of lettuce for tea, not for salads, for tea. We did a lot of hill planting because that's a remnant of the wet season in Africa. The food was impacted by the enslaved. For instance, okra. You would have okra, eggplant, peppers, peanuts, geechee peas, guinea peas. Also we had watermelon. These are geechee peas. Pumpkins, watermelon, before the deer ate it. According to the Lee girls, their grandparents didn't like spinach, so that was out for a year anyway. George Washington Parke Custis was very much into planting potatoes every St. Patrick's Day or St. Patrick's Week. And so did we in the spring. Red cobbler were his favorite, and that's what we have. But what about the other seeds and the plants? Judy found a plant monger, tree mongers, as they were called, the Pickwoads, and I reached out to Mount Vernon for seeds that covered the 19th century that they wouldn't be using. Now, plants and veggies are a hook for people to learn. Look at these guys. They dug their potatoes. I think they dressed themselves as well. And I think they probably, if you asked them today, would remember that they did that. It was like digging for gold. We had in the beginning a park ranger who would plow for us in the spring. We don't use the plow for culture. That helped us quite a bit to clear the land. Here it's plowed, but look who's here, the deer. They're always there. We didn't know what we were going to do about them because we weren't allowed to use soap or hair or wire or anything. So we planted more root vegetables, that helped kind of. We also did structures like this trellis. We called it the cathedral because it got a lot of the crops off the ground if the deer didn't eat them on their way up. But there they are again. So I remember the day we went to the garden and found that all the vegetables had been eaten. And as everyone looked around, they said, well, when did they invent chicken wire? And I thought, I don't know. So I researched that, and 1804 is when that was invented, not in this country, but later it came during that time period. And I took the research to the Park Service, and they agreed that we could have chicken wire, and we do. Now, the deer, if they're really hungry, can push it over, but this is our attempt anyway. We know they grew grapes in the vegetable garden. These are Scuppernong. They're in Georgia. We've had them up a couple times, but most of the grapes were grown where the amphitheater is at Arlington Cemetery. Here's some more of the grapes. We also grew a lot of raspberries and gooseberries. We had a banner year of gooseberries this year. The squirrels just loved them. So unfortunately, corn, we know that Custis had most of his cash crops, as they called them, out on the rest of the property, like corn and wheat and rye. But he also had some corn up in the garden. I'm sorry about that, children of the corn. So, but this is our corn from this year, and it's a flint corn, and it went crazy. So, so far so good. They haven't knocked it down. We know corn was grown close to the house because of this quotation I'm going to read from Eleanor Calvert, who said, I quote, that from the vegetable garden were gathered in the prime of freshness and age what the vegetable world offers to the needs and enjoyment also of man. For there is pleasure mixed with a tomb of loftier feeling in a dish of asparagus just from the earth, white, tender, sweet, and cooked as George the cook knows how to do. There is joy of no mean kind in the young peas that know no pause between the gathering and the being placed on the table, young, green, sweet, and buttery. And what green corn that is 15 minutes from the stalk and 15 minutes to the pot inspire. She also noted that sometimes they would take asparagus and they would use them in the fireplace for decoration. At the time that we started having a lot of production, it aligned quite nicely with AFAC, Arlington Food Assistance Center. And we got permission of the park rangers. I love them, but I didn't want to feed them. So that we could donate the food, and we did to AFAC, and then later to FUA, Friends of Urban Agriculture. What you're seeing right here is actually one of the community and schools programs at Barcroft. And if there are extra things when FUA does cleaning, we will contact them and see if they want extra there. But every Monday and now Thursday, we take our veggies to the pantry. Buckwheat. It is the green manure, and we love it. It's great for pollinators. It restores the soil, and it's that green manure, as I mentioned, but we need kind of more regular manure. After Custis died and Mrs. Lee inherited the property, Ephraim Derricks became the gardener. Mrs. Lee charged her girls to make sure Ephraim received manure for his strawberry patch. This is one of our workers who was rewarded with one of our strawberries. Not much manure was forthcoming. Now you would think the stables at Fort Myer would be perfect. It's like gold, and it's spoken for years in advance, so we didn't get any of that. Having worked at Mount Vernon, I knew the mules of the C&O were wintered there. So I contacted them, and I received from not only them and the horticulture at the time gave us some manure. I don't know who had the animal skulls or the car parts, but it wasn't the best quality, but we were happy to get anything. Through the help of the present horticulturalist, Susan Borchard, the Arlington House Foundation has adopted the garden and has provided manure and compost and trellis material. Other manure used by the Custuses was guano and oyster shells. So if you have some guano around, we'd be happy to have that too. Custis was very much a proponent of the department, creating a Department of Agriculture, and he was a member of the Columbian Historical Society. Meetings were held often in the Smithsonian Castle, and even Abraham Lincoln would drop by to see what was going on and what they were talking about. Oh, I should have mentioned this pathway. Its width is determined by the size of a manure cart. This is what they were talking about, licorice. Everyone was supposed to grow licorice. It was good for you. Now, we have not yet grown licorice, but I suppose it probably was in the vegetable garden. I want to mention another part of the history of the site. I'm a spinner, and I was fascinated by George Washington Parke Custis's sheep breeding program. This is a cup that was awarded in 1809 to a person who had the best ewe lamb. England was cutting off a lot of our woolen imports. And so Custis took a Persian ram from Mount Vernon and crossed it with another sheep to make the Arlington breed. And he continued to do that. Trying to encourage people, what he would do is have fairs and contests of the best homespun, the best product. Much like our county fair, by the way, being held next week, in case you didn't know. Anonymously, Custis entered himself for the best carrots, 7-pounder, and he won. Did he grow it, or did George Clark? Although very successful, when the Spanish opened up their exports of merino sheep, that kind of ruined the Arlington breed. At the same time, there was tons of poison ivy in the pastures, and that was taking out a lot of the sheep as well. It's not an invasive, by the way, so we keep our poison ivy. So thought you'd know. So he pared down his flock, and pretty soon he had one sheep left. That sheep roamed the property and was named Mount Vernon. Other historic sites want to take their heritage seed and give them to us. And the Lincoln's boyhood home in Indiana was the Cushaw squash mecca. Supposedly Thomas Lincoln had been given these seeds down the line, and so this is a heritage seed. They were coming up on an anniversary, and they wanted us to grow Cushaw squash, which we did. They had the Boy Scouts planted, and as the squash started to produce, we were supposed to send it back to them because they were going to make a special beer out of it. Well, somehow during this time, either they realized the postage was pretty much, or the person decided not to make beer out of the squash. So we were left with a lot of it. And so we provided recipes for people and cooking demonstrations so that they would believe that this was a food worthy to eat. And actually it's orange inside, and that's really preferred by a lot of the people that come to the pantry. Now there's a fine balance between if you have a goal of interpreting history and another to provide food for people. I give you the Mangel Wurzel. Mangel Wurzel, M-A-N-G-E-L-W-U-R-T-Z-E-L. It is a beet that was used for cattle fodder, but in the 19th century, people loved the leaves and they loved the beet. We grow some of it We don't think it's going to hit our market or our pantry. I think that would scare people away. But we grow it as a historical factor, and not a lot of it because the deer love it. Now, Molly Custis, the wife of George Washington Parke Custis, was a supporter of the Colonization Society, which backed sending former slaves to Liberia as free people. Once they learned to read and write, of course, which was against the law, but Molly Custis was teaching them to read and write. We know one of the Arlington families, the Burkes, made it to Liberia, and they wrote back and they told Mrs. Custis that they were able to grow lima beans. So there's another plant that we found out about. After the Custises died, Mrs. Lee took over the property. She inherited it. And with 7 children, the garden was really important. You need a lot of veggies. Went away for healing springs for her arthritis. She had rheumatoid arthritis. She would write her girls with directions on running the estate. One such was a letter she wrote to Annie Lee, and I quote, "Tell Rob I depend upon him and Uncle Charles to attend to outdoor concerns, the garden and the park, and to keep the children at work. Do see that they water my flowers. The latter part of next week, I want Billy and Ephraim to wash a bag of wool, and Nurse must see to the dyeing and putting it away, and when Sally and Patsy have done knitting, they can pull it. Daniel must haul some manure for Ephraim's strawberry bed. When you get tomatoes enough, have some cans filled and sealed. Old George picks them and Nurse must do them with some help to seal them up." This is what she was putting them in. These are the cans that were invented at that time. However, 20 years later, the can opener came around. So when you bought these, you needed a chisel and a hammer to get into them. I mentioned the can opener. Mary Custis Lee, one of the daughters, should have paid more attention to old Nurse, who was Judy, by the way, who lived in that slave quarters I was talking about. She was down in Richmond and tomatoes were ready, and she lamented her canning abilities because they all exploded, every one of them. They made ketchup at that time period, and ketchup was anything. Tomatoes was also mushrooms, which you'd gather from the forest. I haven't spoken too much about herbs, but we continually take them to the pantry and know that what was La Cocina, which is now Kitchen of Purpose, they're teaching people to cook, and they're showing how the herbs can enhance the flavor of food. This is borage. It's a great thing to enhance the flavor of cucumbers if you plant it right next to it, and it's great. The bees love it. It's tasty too. You can eat it. You don't want to plant it too close to potatoes because potatoes can get a blight, which can kill the borage. Also, herbs had medicinal uses, which I'm sure you all know. They used rose water in those days like we use vanilla in cooking. An old Nurse would distill the rose water. She'd learned that from Mount Vernon. It was the custom of the Lee girls to braid yellow jasmine and put that on bedding in the house. The only remnant of the yellow jasmine today is growing up the wall of the museum gift shop. That's fun to look at. These are nasturtiums. Of course, you all know that you can eat them and they keep bugs away. I know that Custis used hickory ash as a way to keep bugs away too. The Civil War came and the soldiers decimated the garden. They ate everything. I'm sure they were hungry. A lot of the herbs I talked about were used by them medicinally. They were trying to find a substitute for quinine, which came from other countries. And so they would try for the bark of the, the bark from willows, blackberry, poplar, sweet gum, but it didn't really work. The soldiers also planted poppies thinking that they would have opium, but they didn't. But they did go into the woods, and the woods at Arlington House had wild onion, garlic, mustard, sassafras, pokeweed, artichoke, pepper grass, and dandelion. They were looking for a citrus substitute to prevent scurvy. They were fruitless, unfortunately. They did use okra. We ran out of coffee. So they learned that if you took the seed of the okra and you roasted it, you could make a coffee. I'd like for you all to try that. So I haven't done that yet. In the winter, we put the plants to bed, and this is pine straw that you're seeing here. We did this past year daikon and clover to renew the soil, but one of our volunteers, Mary Resnick, had a connection in South Carolina, and they brought the pine straw up all the way from South Carolina for free. Some of you probably have the pine straw in your yard because we have no place to store it. And so I was looking for anybody to take pine straw from me. You're welcome. We did find that the pH of the soil were really off the charts, and we consulted a lot of experts, our horticulturalists, the Friends of Urban Agriculture, for ideas on how we could get our soil back. And we determined probably in about 5 years. Our garden is to this stage, the scythe and the sickle. This is Ted. And he's cutting down some of the cover crops that were over there. We are actually maybe at 350 pounds. For us, that's good. It feeds some people. We didn't think we'd have that. The problem for us is that we're not allowed to use signage for what we're doing. So when we take and put buckwheat down and people don't know why we're doing it and it looks untidy, we don't have anything to do but cut it down. We can't tell them about that because we don't have the time to do the garden talks anymore. This is buckwheat, and we need to use that. We have a dead area over by our corn. You saw how high it was, and there's some wonderful squash by it, but there's a dead area. So we're going to put the buckwheat in that area. We've stopped work a couple times. This was the recent storm. That's my car. This is as close as I could get to it, but there are trees everywhere. And the path going to the garden was blocked. We had to walk around it. We've shut down also for obviously COVID, but we also shut down for the Rubenstein renovation. And they stage a lot of their equipment on the vegetable garden. So when we started up again, we found a lot of slag, and that could have explained the pH. I don't know. If you come by and see us, we'll give you a hoe. We're there Wednesdays and Saturdays formally, but we're there whenever you want to come. We're grateful to the many groups that have helped our efforts. And through Trudy, Park Ranger Trudy Roth, she's gathered some of the groups for us, and that helps with the volunteers. Our present volunteers, my husband's there, Jonathan. I don't think I have a picture of you, Jen. Pat, Jonathan, Diane, Mary, Jen, Flip, Pam, and Brooke. These are the people that are there all the time. And I want to thank you for this, and remember to save your seeds. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them. Nothing. Yes.
Corn variety, you said?
It's flint corn. It's from one of the Monticello seed packets that you all gave me. Thank you very much. To get our heritage seeds, we go there. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Sandy. It was really interesting.
Oh, good.
Presentation, fascinating.
Good.
Can I ask you, what is the Rubenstein renovation?
Well, David Rubens.
Question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, she asked, what was the Rubenstein renovation? So years ago, the Arlington Foundation formed to raise money to restore some parts of the house. When David Rubenstein stepped up to offer to fund that, then they didn't need to have that, but they've adopted the garden, as I mentioned earlier. So they restored the house. I think it was about 2 or 3 year project. And so it's all up to snuff again. So, yeah. Yeah.
The letter, like, describe the gardening and everything. Did you do your own research to find all that?
Of course. Yeah, but you can find it there's a report on the Custis Lee Mansion that was done by McCormick, and you can find it in there. But Eleanor Calvert's memories are where I found that. And if you didn't hear the question, she asked, where did I find the quote about the gardening and the vegetables? And it was from that, Eleanor Calvert memories.
Does the Park Service work you at all to provide more information, or is that?
Well, I did research from there. I mean, I work for them as a volunteer. And so I want to be correct in the history that I present that reflects the house. But since we had to start way back in the day, there was not much and that we could get to because the archives were closed off for a while. So I knew a lot of things from Mount Vernon, but I didn't have all the pieces together, as you know. And so you find a piece here and a piece there. And some of the things, you know, Charlie Clark, one of our board members, he came out with a book on Custis, which is really good to read if you are interested in that. But I was more interested in the enslaved and in how they made their own gardens. Because if you think about it, they're working all day. When are they going to do their gardens? It's going to be at night. And if you're Sankofa gardening, you're going to use pine pitch to light your garden so you can see what you're doing at night so you can grow the food that you need. So, yeah. And I'm happy to share any of the information with people. Yeah.
Programming for middle school or high school students.
The Park Service certainly does. They have a junior ranger program. We've
Talked about the enslaved people in the garden.
I don't know if their program does. I think that is the new, I mean, not new, but it's more inclusive history. And so I know the Rangers are talking about that. And we have children that come and they get a tour by the Rangers. I think the way they have it now is there's someone meets you and then I watch the Rangers, I'm in the dirt. So they're over under the tree and people are on the bench and they're giving the history of that. And they're talking about the enslaved because you're surrounded on both sides by the north and the south slave quarters. So, yes.
You mentioned at the beginning that your work covered 3 separate eras, the Custis era, the Lee era, the Civil War era. Were there any significant differences between what they grew during those eras, different eras, or basically?
Well, I think the question was there a different in the different eras that I talked about the growing? And yes, there's some new plants that came on the horizon. The Lees are going to plant spinach because the Custises didn't like it. So, but yes, they're looking at new things that are coming in. But with the Civil War, you know, that Mrs. Lee is looking for anything that's going to help her arthritis, for one thing. And there are new inventions coming. I talked about the tin can. Years before, you're just canning. Like Custises would have done regular canning that we know. Whereas in the Lees, the can had been invented and you had to learn how to close it. But maybe more exotic things when the trade opened up to this country after the war. Anyone else?
Does Martin have any questions from the Zoom folks?
So far, none.
Okay.
Oh, there's one. Yes. Oh, good. The history professor, I can't wait.
Does the pine mulch help the pH towards where it's supposed to be? Or
No. We were worried, he asked about the pine mulch that I showed a picture of. We thought it would make it acidic because some pine does, but it did not. It did not, and that person right there tested the soil for us, along with our horticulturalist, Suzanne Borchard. So we did know that wasn't a factor. The thing about the cemetery is you want to cover stuff up. We've tried black plastic, but the wind gets under it. It's not very historic, and it can blow on the graves. You can't use straw because the wind will pick that up and scatter that all over the cemetery. The Park Service has to do a fine line of walking. They're up here on this little island, and the Army's around the outside of that. So we have to be real mindful of that. And I had to get approval for the pine straw to be put down too.
Why can't you use hair to drive away the deer?
Because visitors could eat it. I'm sorry, the question was, why can't you use hair, soap, wire? It's because the visitors could eat it.
Seriously.
That's what I was told, yes. Huh? People, yes. I know.
Okay.
And you can't use nylon cord because people could run into it. Now, I have to say, as years went on, we had people who would give us their remedy for preventing deer, like hot peppers. No, they eat the flowers before the peppers even come. There also, one man told me about a mixture of egg and milk and stuff that stinks really bad. And I found that liquid fence is exactly that. So I got permission from the Park Service to use liquid fence to spray on it. But if it rains, like every other day here, which I love, you have to reapply. And so we go through that pretty quickly.
Sandy, we do have a couple questions from people in Zoom world.
Go ahead.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, first question. How big is the can in the photo that they use for canning?
Well, it's about pressure cookers size. And you need a hammer and chisel. So yeah, pressure cooker size. Mhm.
Okay, the same person asked, when the grounds were off the chart for pH, were they acidic or basic? Any idea of the
It's a high
underlying cause?
phosphorus, very high phosphorus. And we asked Friends of Urban Agriculture to come in, the extension officer to come in, and our horticulturalist as well. And they suggested some things. We had to get approval from the Park Service. And we're just working away at it with natural things if we can.
So it was more acidic, correct?
Phosphorus? No.
No, okay. And then another question. You mentioned that the soldiers found pokeweed in the woods. Isn't that poisonous? How did they use it?
Well, they thought that it would help them, that it would be, it would help scurvy. It depends on when you eat pokeweed. It's a great dye. I know it as a dye, but like I said, it failed. So, yeah.
Okay, and the same person asked the continuing question: if the Custis family was educating slaves and freeing them to go to Liberia, did they staff the gardens with paid workers?
No. It's a paternalistic look at the enslaved. I know better than you do, and I'm going to send you to a country you've never been to before in your whole life. So freedom's wonderful. I mean, the Burkes went and they left family here, but they still used enslaved. They didn't send a lot of the slaves didn't want to go. They had family in the area. They didn't want to go across the seas to some strange place. Luckily, the Burkes did, and they were very successful. And not all of them could read and write, and you needed to have a trade too. Read, write, and then a trade. And that's a long process to do. But no paid. In the beginning, when Custis was doing things down by the Potomac, he paid some Irishmen and also to build the house for the brickwork.
That's all the questions we have in chat.
Okay, Becky?
What do you need from us, from anyone? What would help?
The question was, what do we need for the Arlington garden? I love manure. I really love it. Love it, love it, love it. So, and as I was driving in, I said, ooh, Flip, we should get our truck and just load all this. I'll take compost, I'll take whatever. But the soil really needs some help in certain areas. And I have to say, I didn't mention this, but it's a rectangle, but one side slopes off, sometimes almost 5 to 20 degrees. So the good stuff's going over to the path over here. We go shovel it and we pull it back over to the other side. It's historic how the garden was, so we have to leave it that way. So, but yes, I could use that. I had asked for trellis material, which you guys have given me, seeds, of course. Oh, by the way, save your seeds. You know, we're getting to the part where we're eating everything, so yeah, save your seeds. So more volunteers. We need volunteers. That if we had 8 to 10 volunteers every single day, we could keep up with the weeds. But if you have 8 to 10, some of them will go off on a vacation. So, and yay, but we don't have that core there all the time. And although Trudy Roth does a great job of getting volunteers there, it's not consistent. Like we had Amazon who was going to come once a month on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and they did. But then their different companies, parts of the company broke up. So it hasn't been consistent since then. Not their fault, but yeah. So, yeah, yes.
Not about the growing, but with, well, sort of with the growing. Was this all raised for putting on a ship and sending back to Europe?
No, the question was were the crops grown to go up across the seas? For some of his monoculture crops like wheat, rye, those could go. And there also, he had a market garden too, and that went to Georgetown, and his enslaved person Lawrence was in charge of that. But no, this was to feed the house. And it wasn't fancy like Mount Vernon, no espaliers, no cordons. They didn't expect you to wander through the garden. It was hidden. And I do believe that the enslaved in the North and the South were eating from it and affecting what they were growing too, what they wanted to. Yes.
The same size as it was back when Custis and the subsequent generations.
Yes, the question was, is the garden the same size as it was in the Custis and Lee time period? The answer is yes. It is a 1/4 acre. There are some parts of it that can be seen in some of the little sketches that they had, like we think there was a cold frame on one side. We see another little structure that probably was a rabbit hutch for Agnes's rabbits that Rooney built for her. There was a privy to the back. There is now, if you go in the garden, a white building, which was a shed or a potting shed that was put there later during the Civil War area at the end of the Civil War. So that wouldn't have been there. So, yes. Mm-hmm.
General Montgomery Meigs famously said to bury the Union soldiers in Mrs. Lee's rose garden. Is that on the other side of the house?
It is. That's the show place. And I have to say, if you think about it, besides doing that, and he was a little cranky, you also have to understand that the height of Arlington was a wonderful military advantage because you're seeing everything. And so, yes, there was that, but there also was the advantage for the Union soldiers being up there. Yes.
Any evidence that they kept bees?
They did keep bees, and we know that some, the question was, did they keep bees? They did keep bees, and we know that Sambo Anderson, one of his children, he was from Africa, he lived to be 100, he was freed by Washington. Some of his children came there and he kept bees. He was a carpenter. And we have all those woods that are between the stable and what was the stable and the house. So they did keep bees. We'd love to do that, but you know, they could get people could get bitten, I guess. So, yeah, right, I know. Yeah,
Real quick, one, pokeweed, if you boil the heck out of
Mhm.
it, is a traditional folk medicine for deworming. So,
yes, as a midwife, I. Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't want to bring that up, but
Oh,
okay,
no,
no, he was saying that pokeweed was good for deworming. So,
Cleaning out, basically, yeah.
okay then, okay.
The question was, so I'm assuming from what you said, the Arlington breed of sheep is gone, they're extinct.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, as a merino has so many microns per inch. It is one of the nicest, along with Cornwall and Corriedale. I'm gonna get into my geek sheep thing, but it is good. And the Persian ram that Custis had a fine coat. We know that Lester was also raised at Mount Vernon, and he may have brought some of those too, but he's looking for that ultimate best, because you want to get the most out of it and encourage people to make homespun for their clothing. Then you don't have to rely on England. And in fact, at one time he was thinking of having a woolen mill that he was going to run, that he didn't.
You have the records of how Custis bred the Arlington sheep originally, what breeds he combined?
Yeah, the Persian ram,
Yeah, okay.
and then probably one that had a good coat. But yeah, it goes on for a long time on the breeding program that he had there. Yeah, and he's, if somebody wins for the best ram at his fairs or contests, he's going to buy that ram to put with his sheep. That makes it a better breed for him.
I just wondered if you had enough specifics to recreate it as a heritage breed.
No, the only thing that you can do, like at Mount Vernon, we use Hog Island because they were marooned on Hog Island, Virginia. And they were moved off of there in '76 when the island started to sink. And they were first put at Gunston Hall, Williamsburg, and then Mount Vernon. You have to be real careful with them, because if you crossbreed them and don't get good computer records, they'll get nasal tumors. And a lot of places like the Frontier Culture Museum, they tried for a while and theirs didn't go. Ours are pretty pure. And at Mount Vernon, every year we award for an essay contest one of the sheep at Mount Vernon at the Maryland Sheep and Wool Festival. So that's something to keep the breed going, and with the records that go with it too.
Okay, so there are still some.
Oh, there are, sure. If they're on the barrier islands, because the Spanish would often leave sheep there so that they have a food supply as they're going back and forth. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you all. I hope. Thank you. Come visit. We'll be there.
Okay, Mark, I guess I'll end the meeting.
Okay.
Okay,